Whether you're a veteran DBD player or you're someone who's only heard of the game through YouTube videos, there's one thing that everyone can agree on, and that's how the nurse is undoubtedly the strongest killer in the game and always has been since her initial release all the way back in 2016. But for several years, there was a second killer who was also incredibly strong and sometimes even traded blows with the nurse herself. Even more surprising is the fact that when we first got our hands on that second killer, she was actually not very good at all. That killer was none other than the Spirit, who has had an incredibly controversial history of being kind of bad in the PTB, getting multiple buffs, becoming completely uncounterable, fake gameplay tips being spread, the real counterplay finally being found before finally landing where she is today. The Spirit's first debut was in a PTB all the way back in August of 2018 to very mixed reception. While most people agreed that her visual design was absolutely phenomenal and her ability brought on some very unique gameplay mechanics, she was actually surprisingly weak. So much so that some people actually thought her not being able to see survivors during phasing was too much of a downside compared to what her ability provided her. The Spirit never got a rework, so what could have been so different that she was actually considered weak? I can't find any concrete logs about the changes she got between her PTB and full release, but going from memory, in the PTB, the Spirit had slower movement speed during phasing, shorter phasing duration, a longer ability cooldown, and pinpoint accurate positional audio. What this meant was that if a Spirit was chasing you while phasing, you knew exactly where she was at all times, and the only difference was that she was slightly faster, so survivors would just have to drop pallets slightly earlier than usual, and other than that, they could just treat her like a regular basic attack killer. At the time, the community overall thought that the big issue for her was the previously mentioned pinpoint accurate audio, and I vividly remember playing Survivor during that PTB and looping Spirits for multiple minutes at a time with no issues whatsoever. Even if the Spirit tried mind gaming and doubling back into loop, you could hear exactly when and where she did that and adjust your position accordingly. Now, as you might know, even to this day, the Spirit still has that accurate positional audio and she's still a decent killer, so in hindsight, the audio clearly wasn't the issue. So the Spirit was undoubtedly weak in the test build, and regardless of whatever the reason ended up being, Behaviour decided to play it safe and cover all bases by buffing literally everything about her upon release. So on the 18th of September 2018, the Spirit released into the live game and she received a whole host of changes. These were: buff, longer phase walk duration; buff, faster phase walk movement speed; buff, shorter cooldown on phase walk; buff, removed the directional audio from phase walk. For any of you that were playing DBD around that time, you don't need me to tell you that with these changes, the Spirit was straight up overpowered and unfair. The extra duration and speed on her power granted her better map pressure and better chase pressure, and the reduced cooldown simply allowed her to do more often. Alongside that audio change. I mentioned earlier that even now in current DBD, the Spirit has positionally accurate audio, and she's still good. And let me tell you, without it, she was an absolute monster. Without positionally accurate audio, survivors had no way of knowing where the Spirit was. They would hear the usual whooshing sound, and the volume would be slightly louder if she was closer or quieter if she was further away, but other than that, you had no idea if she was chasing you, someone else, if she was to your left, your right, behind you, you had no idea. Meanwhile, the Spirit, she could see survivors' scratch marks, hear their footsteps, hear their breathing, hear their injured moans, and physically feel them, all while moving significantly faster than the survivor. And by feel, I mean back in those days, when phase walking, the Spirit could still collide with survivors, which meant that even if the Spirit player couldn't track properly with all of that audio and scratch marks, they could just accidentally bump into the survivor whilst invisible and just instantly press the attack button to secure an undeserved hit. So, survivors couldn't see the Spirit, they couldn't hear her, and they certainly couldn't outrun her. So what could they do against her? Well, one of the supposed counters to her was to simply stop sprinting once she went invisible. That way she wouldn't be able to track your scratch marks nor hear your panting or footsteps. But there were two issues that prevented that from being valid counterplay. 1. If you were injured, that simply couldn't work as she would hear your injured moans. Keep in mind, Strider used to trump Iron Will, and because of that, most Spirit players would use Strider. The other, more pressing matter, any Spirit who's played more than one match of her would simply stop phasing once your scratch marks stop, and you wouldn't be able to get very far walking, so she would spot you instantly, and that also wasn't viable. Just like not being subscribed to the channel. Nearly 80% of you watching this aren't subscribed, so if you like the vids, then help me out with a sub. It's also worth noting that if a survivor was within the terror radius of the Spirit's husk, which is the place where she first begins phase walking, they wouldn't be able to hear that whooshing sound at all, so survivors sometimes couldn't even tell if she was using her ability or just sitting there AFK at a vault waiting for you to climb into her arms. To top it off, she originally had an incredibly unfair add-on called Prayer Beads, which completely removed her phasing sound altogether, no matter what, for the entirety of the match. This meant that working on gens would likely get you grabbed with no warning whatsoever, or if you were super lucky, then just a health state. That left survivors with one remaining strategy to deal with a Spirit, which was camp a pallet and guess which side she would pop up from. This is what players referred to as Spirit's 50-50 gameplay. As there was no way for the survivor to tell what the Spirit was doing, all they could do was try their luck at guessing whether the Spirit would pop up on their side of the loop, so they should vault, or if she would pop up on the opposite side of the loop in anticipation of that vault. If you guessed right, you'd live. If you guessed wrong, you'd die. This gameplay was very frustrating for survivors as it shifted gameplay away from tight looping, reading mind games, dodging abilities, etc. into simply 50-50 luck-based gameplay, and nobody likes all of their hard-earned skills to be completely negated by just bad luck. But a lot of people didn't want to just give up and deem her as an instant loss. Some people tried desperately to come up with something to even the playing field against her, and people were getting desperate as the Spirit remained in this unbelievably broken state for years. And one strategy finally developed and gained a fair amount of traction in the community, and you may have heard people quoting this: just look at the shards. You see, the Spirit is covered in little shards of smashed glass all over her body due to her lore where her own father grabbed her by the hair and smashed her straight through a sheet of glass, and the theory that players had come up with was that some of these larger, more prominent shards around her arms and shoulder area would start glowing whenever she was phase walking as a very subtle indicator that she was in fact using her ability, which would be extremely useful information for anyone who was too close to hear the whooshing sound. Eager to prove to the world just how smart they are, many players would repeat the phrase, "just look at the shards," whenever people would criticize the Spirit, as if everyone should have known this by now. One small issue: the shards, in fact, did not glow. They never did. They still don't, and they likely never will. The glowing that I just showed you was editing that I applied in post-production to simulate the effect. In-game, nothing happened. As a matter of fact, some skins for the Spirit outright remove those exact shards. They don't have an actual function attached to them. The shard theory was never true, despite the fact that many players swore they saw it and that it was just really subtle or that it didn't quite work every time. As a result, just look at the shards went from a meme used to mock people for quote-unquote refusing to learn counterplay, and instead became a meme used to mock people that frankly straight up lied about counterplay just because they didn't want a blatantly unfair character to get nerfed. The Spirit would continue to be the subject of constant debates regarding balance and counterplay for years to come, with her reputation being far worse than the Nurse's ever was. Not only was the Spirit's map pressure amazing, but her chase pressure was absolutely insane. While there's no denying that the Nurse has always been crazy powerful, at least there's counterplay to her. Sure, you can't pallet loop against her, but instead what you do is play for distance, line of sight blockers, and mind game. Even if you don't know how to play against the Nurse, most players at least found some comfort knowing that it took a great amount of skill to perform well with the Nurse, so it was at the very least an honourable defeat losing to her. The Spirit, however, she practically played herself in comparison, and while a lack of counterplay is always a bad thing in video games, if a character is going to be so ungodly overpowered that there is not literally one single valid strategy to beating them, at the very least, that character should be difficult to play as too. And just to be clear, the overall community wasn't happy with the nurse either at this point in time, but the hatred towards the Spirit was not even comparable. As the years rolled by, the debate continued and the Spirit continued to cause havoc, and it seemed like nothing could touch her. 2019 rolled by and nothing major happened. 2020 rolled by and still nothing major happened. And halfway into 2021, the DBD community had reached its boiling point. The Spirit released all the way back in 2018, and yet in the year of 2021, she was still completely ruining every match she touched. But the devs still had not made any real attempt at balancing her. At this point, the community was utterly sick of it. Once again, the problem wasn't that she was incredibly strong, the problem was that there was genuinely zero consistent counterplay to her. All you could do is play a palette and pray that she appeared on the opposite side. Community members, pro players, and content creators all ramped up the debate in June of 2021, with a lot of people expressing displeasure with the lack of counterplay. But amongst all the discussion, some pro players were adamant that there actually was a way to tell when the Spirit started to phase, even showing a video where they were able to tell the exact moment a Spirit began phasing each and every time with incredible accuracy. What they were saying was that her animation changes when she begins phasing, and they tried to show in the video the exact moment the change in animation occurred, but in the videos, there was nothing of any note in regards to her animation changing. It's also worth noting that English isn't everyone's first language, and there were a lot of people passing along and reiterating the information, so there could well have been something to it. But as it was presented to the overall community, no one could really piece anything together, so it was once again dropped. And a lot of people to this day still don't know that there absolutely was some truth to it, and there was a way to tell she was phasing. And no, it's not looking at the shards. While her animation did technically change, I wouldn't say that's an accurate way of describing it. She would still play the same animation as normal, the same speed as normal, but the moment she started phasing, her hair would glitch a tiny bit for a couple of frames, likely something to do with animation blending and the Spirit's model detaching from the player. The game would try to continue the animation from the exact same point from a seamless transition, but something wasn't quite 100% perfect, which caused a very subtle glitch with her hair. And just to reiterate, it was 100% a glitch and was in no way an intentional mechanic. And in fact, I think the glitch may have been tied to frame rate, so people playing on 60 FPS probably wouldn't have even had the glitch, but nonetheless, the pros were right. That being said, playing against her was still a guessing game even if you could tell whether she was phasing or not. Sure, you're no longer guessing if she's actually phasing or faking it, but you're still guessing which side she'll stop phasing at, so it didn't change much. And things really needed to change. So finally, in September of 2021, 3 years after her release, things finally did change with a nerf to the Spirit. Nerf. Any survivor within 24 meters of the Spirit will now hear a directional phasing sound. This was great news, but also scary news at the same time. The good thing was that now survivors can tell when she's phasing and hear where she's coming from, so counterplay is finally back on the table. But the bad thing was that in her original PTB, she had directional audio and she was terrible, so surely this would make her rubbish again. Thankfully, not quite. While there's no denying that the directional audio nerf hit her hard, she still holds up a lot better than in that initial PTB. This is likely due to all those other buffs she received at the same time all those years ago. Faster phasing speed, longer phase duration, shorter cooldowns, etc. And while she's nowhere near as strong as she was, she's at least better than most of the roster.